Can you think of any rational reason why you should not try to make your life more pleasurable and less painful? As so long as you're not hurting anyone. Well, that's exactly what we're trying to discover in this book titled Looking Out for Number One: How to Get from Where You Are Now to Where You Want to Be in Life by Robert Ringer. Hello, I'm Daisy, your hostess. Hopefully this book will be a good asset and something that you can put into your toolbox to help you have a better life. And maybe you may not agree with everything that this author has, but if you can discover one or two nuggets that you can implement and it can radically change your life, by gosh, let's go for it. So before I get started on this next chapter, I'd like to give a quick recap on the previous chapter. It is my understanding that as the author brought on that first chapter, he was kind of setting the stage as what it does mean to look out for number one. And I felt, and I took it that way, that it's not from an arrogant point of view that you're ignoring the world, but definitely it's the concept of when you're on an airplane and they tell you, if you're a parent, to put on the oxygen first before you put it on your child. In that sense of a preservation of quality of your own existence. And as you enhance your existence, you are better to serve others, give more to others, and be a better value to yourself and others. So Robert Ringer, the author, goes on to say that, you don't need to be a sacrificial lamb, especially when it comes to people that don't care about you, that have no interest in you. And so in that sense, he's setting that stage that, trying to please everyone is well known, is a sure formula for unhappiness. Additionally, and I do agree with him that there is no such thing as absolute happiness, but there are different degrees of happiness, in my opinion. I know he didn't say this, but my experience has been that as we have those moments of happiness, it allows us to have a foundation for those moments that are not quite so happy and are challenging for us. Additionally, the author talked about paying the price, and that is one of those soul-searching questions. What am I willing to pay for what I believe is going to bring me happiness? And of course, he did mention that inaction can only lead to frustration. So I know that it is a choice for many of us, but the question is, what is the option? If we did take action, how would our life look versus not taking action? And of course, a lot of people take that route because it's the road of least confrontation, the road of least challenge. And many times people are afraid of change. And I think that the sooner that we begin to accept the reality of life, that things are changing, even as we stand still, nothing does remain the same. We can go back to old neighborhoods and we see that slightly many things have changed. If not in the outer, you could sense that as people have passed on, there's a sense that a new generation or new culture is moving in, right? And the author did touch up on worrying, and it seems that there are a lot of people that worry about things that have not come to pass, and sometimes they worry about things in the past that are no longer relevant to this present moment, and so they're sabotaging the present and killing their future. And I loved his statement when he said, why worry about life after death when you're not living this life? And as we progressed into the chapter, he touched up on the topic of winning. Now, when we talk about winning, what does that really mean to you? It's very relative, right? What does it mean to me? And taking on that mindset that truly, if you know what you want to win at happiness. You want to win at some level of happiness. And what does that look like? Perhaps many of us don't want to look at life as being competitive. We just want to coast. The truth is that if we want to be happy, if we have chosen to be happy, then there needs to be some sense that we've got to win at whatever it is that's going to make us happy, and these might be micro moments in life, but if we can kind of isolate them into small little chunks, then life doesn't have to be competition. It can only be things that we can achieve, and we can win at something very personal to us. It doesn't have to mean anything to anybody else, right? And life is a personal design. It's a personal to each one of us, right? And lastly, he talked about the absolute moralists who might be asking, is it moral to, look out for number one? Is that too selfish? Should you be taking this high road? And I loved what Robert Ringer suggested when it comes to the absolute moralist, is that we don't have to allow anyone to impose their beliefs on ours. We have just as much right as the other person to have our own opinion and our own beliefs, to then, take on those extra baggages that don't align with our way of thinking, our way of life, our way of being. And if at the end of the day, our beliefs and opinions don't hurt another being, then we have the right to go on and live the best life ever. We have that right to choose happiness in any way that we choose to pursue and live it. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the page to chapter 2. The reality hurdle. In order to clear the reality hurdle, you must become a realist. A realist is a person who believes in basing his life on facts and has little interest in anything that seems imaginary, impractical, theoretical, or utopian. The biggest problem most people have with reality is that they tend to confuse it with their likes and dislikes. One's personal feelings regarding a reality are not relevant to the reality itself. Scorning someone, the messenger, for pointing out a reality does not alter the reality. And to deceive oneself about reality is the worst of all possible worlds, a habit that, in extreme cases, can be fatal. In the words of Bishop Butler, quote, "Things and actions are what they are, and the consequences of them will be what they will be. Why then should we desire to be deceived?" End quote. Proper perception of reality is as crucial to life as oxygen. Trying to make it through life without a solid grasp of reality is like stumbling around in a dark room laden with landmines. Being aware of what you're doing and why you're doing it, a prerequisite for looking out for number one, means being conscious of what's going on around you. An understanding of reality gives you the foundation for making rational choices rather than allowing your actions to be based on impulse or the choice of others. The theory of reality states, reality is neither the way you wish things to be nor the way they appear to be, but the way they actually are. Either you acknowledge reality and use it to your benefit, or it will automatically work against you. The fact that reality works against you if you choose to ignore it is what makes life such a tough journey for so many people, which is good for me, because if life were easy, you probably wouldn't feel the need to read this book. Instead, you could be living the carefree, glamorous life that Madison Avenue depicts for us on television. But alas, life is not as Madison Avenue portrays it. Life is not a suave-looking hunk decked out in a tuxedo, lounging on a bearskin rug in front of a fireplace and sipping cognac with a sensuous woman clad in a black satin gown. Do these people ever work? Or fight for parking spaces? Or spill their cognac? Neither is life your friendly neighborhood insurance agent appearing at your side like a genie out of a bottle whenever a little problem arises, like your house burning down. The reality is that life is filled with bad stuff. Life is Janice Ian's 70s classic, At 17. To those of us who knew the pain of Valentines that never came, and those whose names were never called when choosing sides for basketball. It was long ago and far away. The world was younger than today, and dreams were all they gave for free to ugly duckling girls like me. It's good to have a positive attitude about life, but it's also important to recognize that life is fraught with difficulties. The more you accept the reality that life is a never-ending series of adversities and obstacles, the more likely you are to remain positive about achieving long-term results. And the good news is that no one can stop you from taking action to overcome the adversities and obstacles in your path. The danger of confusing personal desires with reality is explained in the is versus ought to theories, which states, the degree of complications in a person's life corresponds to the degree to which he dwells on the way he thinks the world ought to be rather than the way it actually is. I think there ought to be no such thing as prejudice, racial, religious, or sexual. I think there ought to be a way to eliminate human rights violations in all countries. In fact, I think the world ought to have no governments or nations at all. I think it should consist of billions of free individuals who have the right to do whatever they please so long as they do not commit aggression against others. Many even believe that there ought to be no necessity to work for a living. Why shouldn't people have everything they want without having to spend most of their waking hours working? It's not hard to understand why clueless college kids become so excited when introduced to Marxism for the first time. And how about a gorgeous, intelligent, understanding woman for every man, and a handsome, intelligent, understanding man for every woman? Surely everyone would agree that this ought to be a reality. While we're at it, there also ought to be no need to waste a third of your life sleeping. There ought to be no such thing as death, and there ought to be a real Santa Claus. Isn't it great to fantasize? For a moment there, I got so carried away thinking about all the things that ought to be that I almost managed to hypnotize myself. And that's exactly what an ought to life is. A life of self-hypnosis, a life based on fantasy rather than reality. It's easy to fall into the trap of allowing your desires and emotions to play tricks on you by creating illusions intended to pass for reality. Unfortunately, while a person spends his time dwelling on ought-tos and makes decisions accordingly, the world continues on its merry way dealing in ises. Of and by itself, of course, the fact that your wishes are irrelevant to reality would not be so bad. It's only when you start substituting wishes for reality that you become a magnet for disaster. Is living in an unreal world of ought-tos really all that bad? I can best answer that by asking another question. Is it really so terrible for a person to jump off a 10-story building because he believes that men ought to be able to fly? This may be a far-fetched example, but it graphically illustrates the dangers that life in the path of the person who lives in a world of ought-tos. Such an individual may succeed in acting out of choice, but it will not be rational choice. You cannot make rational decisions unless you are aware. And if you do not have the ability and courage to recognize and acknowledge reality, you are certain to be unaware. Reality versus perception of reality. I have often heard it argued that reality is not an absolute, that each individual has his own perception of reality. The implication is that because each of us perceives the world through our own eyes, reality itself changes from person to person. While it's true that everyone perceives reality differently, reality could care less about our perceptions. reality does not change to adapt to our viewpoints. Reality is what is. Reality is fact. Reality is truth. Reality, however, is not always known, and that's where perception of reality comes in. While reality is a fixed factor in the equation of life, perception of reality is a variable, which means that you must learn to differentiate between a principle and an opinion. The most significant aspect of a principle is that it can neither be created nor altered. Thus, a principle is the essence of reality. It is what it is, and it's up to us to discover it. The problem arises when people refuse to accept the reality that principles can only be discovered, and instead choose to believe they can create their own principles, which means they believe they can create their own reality, a belief that can lead to disastrous consequences. There are an infinite number of natural laws to be discovered, but fortunately, you don't have to have detailed understanding of every one of them to achieve your goals. However, there is one law with which you must be totally familiar and which you must unfailingly use as a guide for your actions. The law I am referring to is the ultimate, immutable law of nature, the foundation of reality itself. Actions have consequences. Although I believe most of us intellectually understand the inherent truth of this principle, first-hand observation has convinced me that very few people give it more than a passing thought as they go about their daily lives. Why would people ignore such an all-powerful, immutable principle? Because truth can often be harsh, and as human beings, we quite naturally gravitate toward less pain and more pleasure. We simply do not like our little self-delusive worlds to be upset by such a trivial matter as truth. We don't worry about consequences we may have to deal with tomorrow. We just want to feel good today. Unfortunately, we only succeed in deluding ourselves when we engage in such shallow thinking. The reality is that one must be willing to experience the discomfort often associated with truth if his objective is to achieve positive, long-term results. Another major obstacle to an accurate perception of reality is what I like to refer to as the paradigm restriction. We are all confined not only to the planet on which we live, but, metaphorically speaking, we reside within our own mental worlds. It is difficult to comprehend ideas and circumstances we are not accustomed to hearing and seeing within the invisible parameters that surround our lives. In other words, one of the causes of our differing perceptions of truth is that we all start from our own set of assumptions. This is precisely the reason why the serious seeker of truth must learn to question everything and be willing to give up cherished notions, even if it means suffering discomfort. The best antidote for the paradigm restriction is an open mind. This requires rejection of custom and tradition as a basis of fact, and, in its place, acceptance of logic and reason. Clearing the reality hurdle requires that you learn to correctly perceive reality and have the courage to accept it, which is where the Mr. Magoo's and ostriches encounter most of their problems. A Mr. Magoo is someone who simply does not have the mental capacity to correctly perceive reality. He's the individual who truly believes, in spite of mountains of evidence to the contrary, that pie-in-the-sky business deals can be closed, that politicians are better equipped than he is to determine what is best for him, and that other people will act in his best interest and subordinate their own interest to his needs, which means, in simple terms, that a Mr. Magoo is totally out of touch with reality. Unless somewhere in the mysterious depths of a Magoo's brain there lies a reality perception seed that has not yet blossomed, his fate is irrevocably sealed. If he does possess such a dormant seed, there's always the hope that he can overcome the enormous odds against him and learn to correctly perceive and acknowledge reality. But if the seed has been undernourished and neglected for too long, the odds are against its ever sprouting. Of course, if such a seed doesn't exist to begin with, the Magoo's case is hopeless. About all you can do for such a person is offer him your condolences. An ostrich is an entirely different creature than a Mr. Magoo. The ostrich has the mental capacity to correctly perceive reality, but stubbornly refuses to do so, preferring instead to live in a fantasy world of ought-tos. Hard as it is to believe that anyone would make such a conscious choice, millions of people do so on a regular basis. The ostrich is more tragic than Mr. Magoo because an individual who knows the facts but refuses to acknowledge them is the greatest of all fools. These are the kinds of fools we see so often on television, such as students and professors from some of our most prestigious centers of learning who harbor convoluted, incoherent ideas about such abstracts as social justice and saving the world. They may have a significant amount of knowledge, but their knowledge is corrupted by their misguided desire to recreate the world in their own image. One note of caution: you should never confuse an ostrich with the liar. Ought-tos are not the liar's game. The liar is a person who correctly perceives reality, but purposefully attempts to hide it from others. In other words, he is sharply focused on purposeful deceit. As one might expect, one of the most prominent natural habitats of the liar is found in the bowels of government. With the exception of the liar, then, when a person speaks of reality, what he is really referring to is his perception of reality. Everything that has ever been written, taught, or believed is based on someone's perception of reality. For example, everything in this book is based on my perception of reality. You are, of course, free to accept or reject any or all of my interpretations of reality. And where we have differences of opinion, one of us will suffer negative consequences to the degree to which his perceptions are incorrect. Conversely, to the degree either of us is correct in his perception of reality, his results will tend to be positive. But the one thing that will never be affected by our respective views of reality is reality itself. The reality of relativity. Finally, an important reality of life that is too often forgotten. Virtually everything that happens to you is relative. To effectively deal with obstacles, you must first place them in proper perspective. If you allow any problem to be magnified beyond its merits, you're sure to have difficulty handling it in a rational manner. In my early 20s, while stumbling around the streets of New York trying to promote a number of too-good-to-be-true deals, I developed an interesting relationship with an elderly, wealthy gentleman, Harold Hart, who was a classic Lower East Side to Park Avenue success story. He had started out as a struggling, impoverished youth, but managed to amass a fortune by his early 40s. He had it all: a chauffeured limousine to take him to and from Wall Street each day, an impeccable, expensive wardrobe, and a luxurious Park Avenue apartment decorated in early rich. On several occasions, I had the opportunity to visit Mr. Hart at his home and came to know him quite well. The purpose of my visits was to try to induce him to invest in some too-good-to-be-true venture, such as sulfur mine in Tibet or gold panning expedition in Tasmania. Though I consistently failed in my efforts to get him to part with any of his money, I obtained far more than I had bargained for in the form of knowledge and wisdom. I vividly recall visiting Mr. Hart on one particular occasion when he was resting tranquilly in his favorite armchair. As usual, he was garbed in silk robe and pajamas, with servants waiting on him hand and foot. During the first few minutes of my visit, I recall observing the surreal scene as Mr. Hart sat quietly with a blank stare on his face. Then, without warning, he served up an unforgettable philosophical tidbit to me. In a barely audible monotone, Mr. Hart looked at me and said, quote, "You know, nature has played a great hoax on man. All your life, you strive to achieve success. You overcome endless obstacles and setbacks. You play all the silly little games that are required of you, and if you're lucky, you finally make it to the top. Well, I made it to the top a long time ago, and you know what? It doesn't mean a damn thing. I tell you, nature has made a fool of man, and the biggest fool of all is me. Here I sit, in poor health, exhausted from years of playing the success game, knowing that time is running out, and I keep asking myself, now what? What's your next clever move going to be? The endless hours I spent working, worrying, maneuvering, negotiating, it was all for nothing. It's all so meaningless now because as I near the end, I realize that life is nothing more than a giant hoax. We think we're so important, but the truth is that we're nothing." End quote. A few months after that cheerful little dissertation, I was informed that Harold Hart had passed away. That was many years ago, but today his words and the tone in which he spoke them still ring in my ears. Has nature made a fool of man? Is life just a big hoax? Though many years have passed since that memorable evening in his Park Avenue apartment, I still am not certain of the answers to these questions. However, even if life is not a hoax, even if it is of universal importance, it does not necessarily follow that every problem we face is significant when juxtaposed against the endless complexities of the world, let alone the universe. The reality is that all problems are relative. Nevertheless, some people react to a spilled cup of coffee with the same degree of stress that one would expect to experience when told that a terrorist attack is imminent. What such people lack is an understanding of the theory of relativity, which states, in order to settle on a rational course of action or inaction, one must first weigh all pertinent facts in a relative light and carefully define his terms. That you and I have problem is a given. The fundamental question is, problems relative to what? Is middle age depressing you? In countries where the average life expectancy is 40, men and women are spared such a depression. Health problems? While any illness is disconcerting, the severity of a non-terminal illness must still be measured against the fatal medical conditions of untold millions of people worldwide. Grocery bills getting you down? Hundreds of thousands of people die every day from starvation in third world countries, while millions more suffer from malnutrition. Unemployed?
relative to a person who lives in an underdeveloped country and has an annual income of $300, temporary unemployment in a Western country isn't all that serious of a problem. Coping with the high cost of rent? Maybe you'd rather be a pavement dweller in Calcutta, India. These lucky people are born, live and die on the pavement. The only thing they have to worry about is finding a rag to spread under their heads at night. While these kinds of horrors continue along at their normal pace, we throw tantrums over being relegated to a poorly located table in our favorite restaurant, are frustrated because we can't seem to lose weight, and worry endlessly about money problems. It's all a result of the human tendency to be self-absorbed, a tendency that in turn makes it difficult for people to think about the pain and suffering of others. Human dilemmas such as loneliness, financial problems, and government oppression at times overwhelm us. They prod some to drink, others to take drugs. They cause ulcers, migraine headaches, and high blood pressure. They can also produce stress and anxiety and precipitate serious mental and emotional disorders. The more your perspective is restricted to your own sheltered environment, the more likely you are to perceive minor difficulties as major problems. And when that occurs, it results in an unwarranted loss of finite time and energy. Harkening back to Harold's Hart's somber words on that unforgettable evening in his apartment reminds me that a person should make it a point to periodically step back and ask himself, what if, in the overall scheme of things, my problems don't even matter? What if I'm allowing myself to become stressed and anxiety-ridden when, with just a slight reorientation of my perspective, I could experience tranquility and contentment? Macro problems. To place problems in proper perspective, from time to time it's healthy to think about macro problems. By macro problems, I'm referring to potentially world-ending issues. Take, for example, overpopulation. Barring outside interference, the population of a species increases in geometric proportions. Giving the majority of expert opinion the benefit of the doubt, this has resulted in man's proliferating to a population of about 10 million in a span of somewhere between 1 to 3 million years, assuming you buy the Darwin theory of evolution, at least to the extent you believe that today's man evolved from a humanoid that lived prior to the development of civilizations. Then, increasing his numbers to 6 billion in just the next 10,000 years. In graphic mathematical terms, what this means is that the world's population is increasing at the rate of more than 2 people per second. It is generally estimated that we will reach a world population of 14 billion by the middle of this century, assuming, of course, that we make it that far. So where does it all end? Well, believe it or not, there is a limiting factor called space. Mathematicians tell us that if we continue at our present growth rate, 2% per annum population increase, in about 600 years, the people then living will be faced with the rather awkward dilemma of having one individual for each square foot of land on our planet. Some scientists believe that the solution is to colonize other planets. But is that really feasible? I recall reading an article many years ago by a physicist who was hypothesizing about a journey to another hospitable planet. He calculated that if a spaceship traveled at the speed of light, by the time it reached the nearest planet with environmental conditions resembling Earth's, meaning, I assume, Big Mac wrappers lying on the sidewalks, strip centers on every block, etc., the population of the spaceship, assuming it had departed with 3 people aboard, would equal the population of planet Earth at the time of its departure. What kind of time period am I talking about? Reaching just the planets in our own solar system would be a big enough problem, but it doesn't matter, because all of them have totally inhospitable temperatures and atmospheres anyway. Venus is enshrouded with sulfuric acid clouds. Mars's atmosphere approximates car exhaust, and Jupiter has been described as a giant sulfur and phosphorus matchhead. Given these anti-life realities, it is highly unlikely that we will ever colonize another planet in our solar system. How about solar systems? Would you believe that the nearest star, repeat, nearest, Proxima Centauri, is 4.3 light years away? That's 25 trillion miles. What this means is that if we could build a spaceship capable of traveling at the speed of 1 million miles per hour, it would take 6,000 years to make a round trip to our closest neighbor. The ultimate problem shrinker. The greatest problem shrinker I've ever run across is the late exobiologist Carl Sagan's cosmic calendar. As Sagan explained it, if the eons that comprise the lifetime of Earth were compressed into the span of a single year, recorded history would occupy the last 30 seconds of the last day of such a year. Which means that the combined length of time it took to fight World War I and World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, and the Iraq War, which by secular standards were pretty serious problems, would occupy only a millifraction of a second in the lifetime of our planet. From this perspective, when someone shafts you in a business deal, does it really deserve the status of being able to give you a nervous breakdown? If you try to squeeze such an event into Sagan's cosmic calendar, there wouldn't be a time measurement small enough to record it. To be sure, our everyday problems are real and often frustrating and painful. But viewed from Sagan's cosmic calendar perspective, few of them hardly deserve to be rated catastrophic. Consider, for example, that in the late 1930s and early 1940s, Adolf Hitler, through vital mass hypnosis, meted out morbid death sentences to more than 6 million innocent people. In Scarsdale, more than 30 years later, a descendant of one of those victims believes he is burdened by enormous difficulties. Someone at the office is vying for his position. His doctor has just informed him that he must give up smoking or face grave consequences, and his wife is threatening to leave him if he doesn't spend more time with his family. Yet, if this man were to be put in a time machine and found himself in Auschwitz in 1942, he would be incapable of identifying his future Scarsdale dilemmas as problems. Likewise, if you were to find yourself in Hiroshima in the summer of 1945, I'd say you'd have a big problem. But if you were recently passed over for a promotion at work, it's not a world-ending event. About 300 years before Jesus appeared on earth, at a time when people's minds were not flooded by such serious concerns as who would win the NBA Finals, the World Series, or the Super Bowl, Taoist philosopher Chuang-Tzu had time to reflect soberly on life. Once upon a time, I dreamt I was a butterfly, fluttering hither and thither, to all intents and purposes a butterfly. I was conscious only of following my fancies as a butterfly, and was unconscious of my individuality as a man. Suddenly I awoke, and there I lay, myself again. Now I do not know whether I was then a man, dreaming that I was a butterfly, or whether I am now a butterfly, dreaming that I am a man. And just think, you're worrying yourself sick over unpaid bills, a mate who refuses to see things your way, a garage mechanic who presents you with a bill that's $100 more than his original estimate, and for all you know, you're nothing but a butterfly having a bad dream. Or maybe our whole universe is nothing more than a ping pong ball that has fallen off a table in a world of giants. Worse, what if you and I happen to be living at a time when that ping pong ball is about to hit the floor? When you cut problems down to their true, i.e., relative size, you will find them remarkably easier to handle. Is your greater concern of the moment really all that important when placed against the circumstances of billions of people around the globe? Don't make the mistake of getting so caught up in your day-to-day problems that you are unable to view them in a relative light. Most people carry far more baggage than necessary on their journey through life, and, like the airlines, nature charges us for the excess baggage. But the odds are pretty good that you can't afford the cost of that baggage, which is why you would be wise to lighten up your load by reflecting on your problems in a relative light rather than pressure cooking them. Keep your troubles in proper perspective and master the art of taking them one step at a time. With rational analysis, you may even find that many of your problems are not really problems at all. After all, we just use the word problem to refer to a fact or a set of facts that we don't like. Whenever the word problem pops into your mind, you should quickly ask yourself, problem relative to what? You must learn to view events in a relative light if you are to successfully make it over the reality hurdle. Up and over. It is of monumental importance to become adept at differentiating between reality and unreality, between fact and fiction, between what works and what doesn't work. Unfortunately, most people live in a totally unreal world. As discussed earlier, they create a world in their own minds based on the way they would like the world to be rather than the way it actually is. They would much rather delude themselves by ignoring the facts, even if their self-delusion only prolongs the inevitable. While the development of a correct perception of reality is not an easy task, due in no small part to our being surrounded by a world of delusions, the nice thing about it is that anyone can get better with practice, provided he is committed to truth, which means being willing to subordinate your desires and wishes, your dreams, as it were, to reality. That is not to say you should not have dreams. On the contrary, dreams can provide the fuel for persevering. However, you should never allow your dreams and desires to be so all-consuming that they repress reality. Put another way, your love of truth must be greater than your desire to make your dreams come true. In a free country, of course, you have a right to go on believing whatever you want to believe. But at the same time, you should recognize that reality is not discriminatory, meaning that nature does not accept ignorance as an excuse for making wrong decisions. It metes out negative consequences just as harshly to a person who is well-meaning but misinformed as to someone who is malevolent and stubborn. Not once has reality excused anyone for good motives. So consistency is essential when it comes to having a proper perception of reality. The nice thing about reality is that you do have a choice. You can choose to accept reality and use it to your benefit, or you can ignore it and allow it to create havoc in your life. A wise person makes a serious effort to avoid the pitfall of confusing the way he believes things ought to be with the way they really are. Never be so afraid of truth that you refuse to acknowledge it. How are you to deal effectively with the facts if you deny their existence? When you correctly perceive reality, delusions begin to disappear. And as delusions vanish from your life, you are able to deal more effectively with problems on a rational basis, which in turn leads to long-term success. End of chapter. All right. Hit that like button and let's head over to the next video where we continue on to the next chapter titled The Intimidation Hurdle. Looks like it's something that many of us may need to jump over, right? Please do consider subscribing to the channel. If there is anything here that you feel that someone else could benefit from, please do share this video.